I have to admit something. Even though I like to talk a lot about iPhones, apps, and Apple Watch tips, I'm relatively new to iPhones. My very first smartphone was an iPhone 3GS. After that, I exclusively used Android phones until I got an iPhone 13 Pro last year. And I immediately fell in love with the camera. The images I got from it were some of the best I'd ever seen from a smartphone, and the new cinematic mode opened up a whole new avenue of smartphone videography. It helped me think about the smartphone videos differently, less like home movies, and instead putting more intention behind the shots I was getting. The 13 Pro was such a game changer for me that I actually stopped bringing around my mirrorless camera and instead relied solely on the phone. This is all essentially a long-winded way of saying that I had high hopes for the iPhone 14 Pro and its camera, and considering I had such a connection with the 13 Pro's camera, the 14 Pro had a lot to live up to. Well, I've been using it for just over a month now, so let's find out how it did. The big new feature this year is the 48 megapixel camera sensor. That's 4 times as many megapixels as last year's 13 Pro. Does that mean 4 times the quality? Well, I'll touch on that later. Because of all those new megapixels, it means that there's now a new 2 times zoom lens on the 14 Pro. It's not actually a new lens, but rather just the main lens cropped in a bit. And thanks to the 48 megapixel sensor, it can do this without any loss of quality. And I actually really like this. Often the main camera can be just a little bit too wide, and the drop off in quality when using the 3 times lens can often mean it's not really worth using. So having something in the middle with the quality of the main camera came in really nicely. Oh, it's also worth mentioning that this phone isn't the 14 Pro. It's actually my 13 Pro. I've been shooting on the 14 Pro using cinematic mode this whole time, so let's actually talk about that. This is a feature that we've been waiting a year for, and that's cinematic mode at 4K and 24 FPS. This isn't the biggest change in the phone, but certainly a welcome one, and makes the iPhone 14 Pro a greater asset when it comes to trying to get quick cinematic shots on the fly. And speaking of grabbing shots on the fly, another brand new feature on the 14 Pro is action mode. This is essentially taking the stabilization that was already present in the iPhone and turning it way up to 11. It's something we've seen in smartphones before, and it's very similar to the stabilization available in action cameras like the Insta360 and GoPro, essentially negating the need for a gimbal. The major downside though is that it can only shoot up to 2.8K. This isn't a huge deal, as that's still plenty of resolution for social media, but it does crop in slightly so to make room for stabilization. Now, this isn't a feature I was necessarily pining for, as I think the stabilization that's already there is excellent. But where I did find it to be especially useful was when using the 3 times lens. It made video from that camera so beautifully smooth and so simple to capture gorgeous imagery. So let's talk about that 48 megapixel sensor, the biggest that's ever been put in an iPhone. But does it make a difference? Not really. If you study the images and compare them to the ones from the 13 Pro, sure, they do look ever so slightly sharper. But if you were to just look at them at a glance, I don't think you could tell. Now, that's not to say the 48 megapixel sensor is useless. I love the 2 times lens that's come from it. And if you're someone who regularly shoots Pro RAW on the iPhone, then having those 48 megapixels allows for a huge amount of flexibility when editing. And you know, Apple has done something quite clever with this. While the sensor is capturing 48 megapixels worth of data, if you're shooting with the regular HEIC codec, then it's going to compress the image down to a 12 megapixel size. This is excellent, as you're technically getting 4 times the perceived quality, but not 4 times the file size, so the new photos aren't going to fill up your iCloud any quicker. The photos still look excellent with outstanding clarity and color reproduction. Sadly though, we haven't seen much of an improvement when it comes to the ultra-wide and telephoto lenses. The ultra-wide has a new f2.2 aperture along with the new photonic engine image processing system, so low-light photos are improved somewhat compared to last year's 13 Pro. The telephoto is somewhat similar though. No real improvement, but the photonic engine does improve photos taken in unfavorable situations. So where do we stand at the end of this? I mentioned at the start that the camera on the iPhone 13 Pro really transformed my photography experience, so much so that I posted edited photos from that camera on Instagram beside photos I'd taken on my mirrorless camera, and they were nearly identical when it comes to quality. But is there enough new stuff going on the 14 Pro that I think you should upgrade? No. The cameras on this phone are obviously fantastic and definitely an improvement over last year, but just a very incremental improvement. So unless you're really pixel peeping, I don't think you're gonna notice. But in saying, if you're still rocking an iPhone 12 or an 11, then this would definitely be worth the upgrade. So am I a little disappointed? I mean, maybe a little. But also, I'm kind of glad I'm underwhelmed because it means I get to use my 13 Pro for another year. And by the time the 15 Pro comes out, hopefully it'll have some more features worth upgrading for. So if you enjoyed this video, I would really appreciate it if you checked out the rest of our videos, like this one right here. I think you'd like this one.